Tiddo's Channel's Power and Puff lipstick. Here is the detail that no cosmetics company ever wanted printed on a magazine page. By the time the average American woman reached 45 years of age in 1954, she had spent more cumulative hours applying and removing her face than she had spent eating dinner with her family. That number came from a quiet internal survey commissioned by the Ladies' Home Journal and promptly buried in an editor's drawer, because the implication naturally was not one that advertisers paying $12,000 per full-colour page cared to underwrite. The cold cream ritual was not a luxury. It was a full-time occupation, conducted in silence, every night, for decades, with the bedroom door shut and the children already asleep. And at the centre of that ritual, pressed into a thick white cylinder of hydrogenated oils and mineral emollients, was a product that had been commercially produced in the United States since 1872, and had somehow convinced 3 consecutive generations of women that removing their makeup required a cream nearly identical in composition to the one Hippocrates had recommended for inflamed skin in 400 BCE. The cold cream story begins not in a vanity drawer but in a factory. Specifically, the Chesebro Manufacturing Company's Newark plant in the early decades of the 20th century, where laboratories were already experimenting with oil-in-water emulsion technology borrowed from the pharmaceutical industry. But it was Pond's Extract Company that transformed cold cream from a pharmacist's remedy into a domestic sacrament. The Pond's Angel Face campaign of the late 1930s had already established the brand as aspirational, but it was the post-war 1950s push that cemented what historians of material culture now call the two-cream economy, the understanding hammered into women's consciousness through Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping and McCall's, that a proper woman maintained 2 separate creams, one for removing, one for nourishing. The cleansing cream removed the theatrical armour of the day. The vanishing cream, a lighter formulation, was pressed in afterward to protect the skin overnight. Together they represented a philosophical architecture, the self you showed the world and the self you maintained in darkness. The environmental context of the 1950s matters enormously here, and is almost always omitted from beauty histories focused entirely on glamour. American cities in this decade were still cloaked in the particulate legacy of the coal era. Pittsburgh in 1950 remained so heavily polluted that streetlights burned at noon. Chicago, Detroit and Cleveland experienced chronic air inversions that left a grey film on window ledges, car hoods, and, critically, on the pores of anyone who spent more than an hour outdoors. Women who worked in offices near manufacturing corridors would return home with a literal grime overlay on their foundation. Not metaphorical surface dirt, but an actual chemical deposit of sulfur dioxide particulates mixed with pigmented cosmetic wax. Cold cream became, in this context, an environmental necessity as much as a beauty ritual. Cutting through the oxidized layer of pancake foundation, an urban particulate with an efficiency that soap and water alone could not achieve. Woodbury facial soap understood this perfectly. Their advertising language shifted in 1951 to include direct references to city air, urban stress, and the particular challenge of the modern woman's environment, code, barely disguised, for factory smoke and automobile exhaust. What the magazines never explained in full technical language, but what every woman who had spent real money on cold cream understood instinctively, was the emulsion chemistry at work. Cold cream is an inversion system. Oil suspended in water, kept stable by an emulsifying agent. Originally beeswax in Galen's ancient formula, later mineral wax and borax in the commercial iterations produced by Pond's, Noxzema, and Dorothy Gray. When pressed into the skin, the oil phase softened and dissolved pigment particles suspended in the foundation's own oil base, dissolves, as any high school chemistry student could recite, though no advertisement would have used such clinical language when melts away impurities like morning dew on a rose petal was available instead. The tissue removal phase that followed was equally precise. The practiced hand used short, upward strokes, never downward, never lateral, which could stretch the delicate under-eye skin, and applied exactly the right pressure to lift rather than drag. Women who had been doing this for 20 years did it with their eyes closed. They did it in the dark, by feel, the muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions rendering the mirror not merely unnecessary but almost beside the point. Helena Rubinstein, who had built a cosmetics empire specifically on the premise that women required expert guidance to manage their own faces, introduced her Vala's skin cream in the early 1900s and spent the subsequent 5 decades expanding the philosophical framework around it. By the 1950s, her salons offered what she called skin diagnoses, consultations during which a white-coated beauty technician would examine a client's face under a clinical lamp and prescribe a specific regimen. Rubinstein's genius, and it was genuine genius, was the medicalization of vanity. By treating skincare as a science requiring professional intervention, she elevated the nightly cold cream ritual from personal habit to medical compliance. A woman who skipped her cold cream was not merely lazy, she was, in the Rubinstein formulation, neglecting her health. Elizabeth Arden ran the same play from the opposite aesthetic direction, her pink door salons positioned as luxury wellness retreats, where the cold cream application was performed by trained aestheticians in rooms that smelled of orange blossom and French soap. Between them, these two women, immigrant, ambitious, and fiercely competitive, defined what skincare meant in post-war America for an entire generation of women who had never set foot in either of their salons but had absorbed their philosophies through magazine advertisements and drugstore packaging. The ritual itself, as practiced in the American household of 1952, was more elaborate than its domestic context suggested. It began at the dressing table, not the bathroom vanity, which was considered insufficiently ceremonious for the full removal sequence, with the hair pinned back using a terry cloth headband or a scarf twisted and knotted at the crown. The cold cream was removed from its wide-mouthed jar with the ring finger, which exerts the least pressure of any finger on the hand, a piece of technical knowledge that women shared in women's magazines under the heading Beauty Hints, in a matter-of-fact tone that assumed every reader had already absorbed the basics. The cream was applied in upward circles on the cheeks, pressed lightly into the under-eye area, worked along the jaw and chin with a slight lifting motion. Then came the wait, approximately 45 seconds to 2 minutes, depending on the heaviness of the day's foundation and whether the woman had been outdoors in summer heat, which caused pancake makeup to oxidize more deeply into the skin surface layer. Pond's recommended a minimum of 60 seconds in their instructions printed on the inside lid of every jar, a detail almost no one read but everyone somehow followed by instinct. Then the tissues. Kleenex had achieved market dominance in this period, displacing handkerchiefs as the standard removal implement, pressed and lifted, never rubbed, until the cream came away in a pale beige-tinted cloud. The second pass distinguished the serious practitioner from the casual one. A dedicated woman applied a second thin layer of cold cream after the first removal, allowed it to sit briefly, and removed it in turn with a fresh tissue. The logic was sound. The first pass removed the surface cosmetics. The second pass removed the residual cream itself, plus any remaining particulate, embedded below the initial foundation line. Department store beauty counters in this era would demonstrate this process, sometimes 2 pass, sometimes 3, to women who had been using cold cream their entire adult lives and had never once questioned whether they were doing it correctly. The discovery that their technique had a specific, professionally validated sequence often created in them a kind of retrospective pride. The ritual they had performed nightly by feel and inherited habit was, it turned out, precisely what the experts recommended all along. Cold cream's quiet persistence into the 21st century is its own kind of testimony. When the decade of minimalist skincare arrived in the 20-teens, with its single-ingredient serums and its celebration of skin cycling and barrier protection, dermatologists reached back into the archives and discovered that cold cream's emollient composition, mineral oil, beeswax, water, did not clog pores, did not disrupt the skin barrier, and did not, contrary to the prejudices of the retinol era, accelerate aging. The old-fashioned cream that women pressed from a white jar by the light of a bedside lamp every night in post-war America had been doing exactly what it promised all along. And perhaps that is the sharpest thing to be said about the cold cream era. In a decade when advertising constructed elaborate mythologies around every product, from cigarettes to dishwashing liquid, the cold cream advertisement was telling a version of the truth. The skin felt better in the morning. The ritual worked, whether it worked because of the cream's chemistry or because 10 minutes of quiet, deliberate self-attention at the end of a long domestic day constituted the only unclaimed space in a woman's schedule, was a question that no beauty editor had the vocabulary to ask in 1954. But the women at the vanity table, pressing their ring fingers in careful upward circles in the amber glow of the dressing table lamp, may have understood it without needing to articulate it at all. The commercial architecture supporting this ritual was vast, and it was constructed with deliberate precision on the foundations that wartime advertising had laid. During the Second World War, women's magazines had maintained advertising revenues by shifting their beauty advertising from aspirational desire to patriotic duty, a remarkable rhetorical maneuver that positioned buying cold cream not as self-indulgence, but as the responsible maintenance of civilian morale. Pond's, specifically, ran a campaign throughout the early 1940s featuring the wives of servicemen and diplomats, testifying to their faith in the brand, each brief testimonial constructed to communicate something beyond mere consumer endorsement, that the women who kept their faces clean and their complexions tended were the women who kept the home front functional. The brand was aligned, in this narrative, with the values of reliability, constancy, and care, the same values that the war required of every woman who stayed behind while her husband crossed an ocean. When peace arrived, Pons did not abandon this rhetorical alignment so much as translate it into the domestic register. The peacetime Pons advertisement featured not the diplomat's wife but the bride's mother, the college girl preparing for her first important interview, the young homemaker whose husband came home every evening to a wife who had attended to herself. The message had shifted from patriotism to aspiration, but the underlying proposition remained constant. The cold cream ritual was evidence of a woman who took care of herself, who took care of her appearance, who took care of the people around her through the medium of her own composed and tended face. The product remained identical. The meaning it was sold with evolved to meet the moment. The pharmaceutical dimension of the cold cream market deserves more attention than beauty histories typically provide. Noxzema, introduced in 1914 by Baltimore pharmacist George Bunting as a remedy for sunburn and eczema, its name, a contracted form of Nox eczema, was positioned from the beginning in the therapeutic rather than the purely cosmetic register, a positioning that it maintained through the 1950s with remarkable consistency. Noxzema's marketing in the post-war decade emphasized the medicinal heritage of its camphor and eucalyptus formulation, and women who used Noxzema often described doing so in terms that more closely resembled healthcare than beauty care. The cold blue jar with its white label occupied the medicine cabinet shelf alongside aspirin and iodine rather than the dressing table shelf alongside perfume and powder, and that placement communicated a specific relationship between the product and the self. This was maintenance, not enhancement, hygiene, not glamour. The women who chose Noxzema over Pons were not making an inferior choice. They were making a different statement about what their nightly ritual meant. And yet, the ritual was not quite finished, because after the cold cream, after the vanishing cream, after the headband came off and the lamp dimmed, there was still the question of the morning, still the question of the mirror, still the question of 6 minutes between the alarm and the bus stop, and a face that required something more than just confidence to present itself to the world. How exactly did she do it? The answer begins in the most theatrical place imaginable, and it begins with a spotlight. On the morning of April 17th, 1955, Two women arrived at the Paramount Studios makeup department in Hollywood within 40 minutes of each other, and the contrast was so absolute that the head of the department, a man named Wally Westmore, who had been painting faces professionally since the days of silent film, reportedly went home that evening and told his wife that he had spent the day working in two entirely different centuries simultaneously. One of the women was Grace Kelly, 25 years old, and 3 weeks from completing principal photography on To Catch a Thief. The other was Marilyn Monroe, shooting early scenes for what would become The 7-Year Itch. Kelly sat in her chair with the stillness of a woman who understood exactly what she was, took the brushes as they came, and emerged from the chair in roughly 50 minutes looking like a painting that had decided to be three-dimensional. Monroe took nearly 2 hours, asked questions about every product being applied, and left the chair looking like a rumour that had decided to be real. The difference between them was not merely aesthetic, it was philosophical, and it defined the entire cosmetic architecture of the 1950s. The Hollywood studio makeup department in this era was not a room. It was an institution. The Westmore family, Father George and his sons Wally, Bud, Perk, Ern, Frank and Mont, had established something close to a monopoly on the faces appearing on American movie screens since the 1920s. Each brother appointed as head of makeup at a different studio, the family collectively determining what beauty looked like in a medium that 50 million people consulted each week for guidance. By the early 1950s, the Westmores had codified a set of techniques that moved between stage, screen and civilian life in ways that no advertising campaign could replicate. They had access to living proof. When Bud Westmore applied a technique to an actress's eye at Universal, and that actress appeared on a 50-foot screen 6 months later, and every woman in the audience leaned forward slightly in her seat and thought, "How did she do that?" The answer was already being decoded on the beauty pages of Photoplay magazine, filtered through the chemical limits of what a woman could actually purchase at a Rexall drugstore counter. The distinction between the Kelly archetype and the Monroe archetype was not, as later cultural critics sometimes framed it, a distinction between intelligence and sexuality, or between restraint and excess. It was a distinction between two entirely different theories of what makeup was for. The Kelly approach, which Hollywood's publicity departments called the natural finish philosophy, operated on the principle of enhancement without disclosure. You applied the product in such a way that the effort became invisible, that the result appeared to be the face itself rather than the performance layered over it. Foundation was blended past the jawline and below the earlobe to eliminate any border between treated and untreated skin. Powder was pressed, never dusted, with a velvet puff to flatten any surface irregularity without creating the chalky opacity that cheaper powders left on dark skin tones. Blush was applied so high on the cheekbone that it functioned as contouring before contouring had its name, catching light at precisely the angle that most film cameras of the period found most flattering. The result was the face of a woman who appeared to have made no effort whatsoever, which was, of course, the most exhausting kind of effort there is. The Monroe approach worked from the opposite premise. Monroe's makeup was not designed to disappear, it was designed to announce. Her foundation, Max Factor's Pancake in Natural, was applied in a slightly thicker layer than the Kelly standard, then set with a pearl-tinted powder that added luminosity rather than matte opacity, because Monroe's team had discovered that a face lit slightly from within read on camera as heat rather than artifice. The lip was painted beyond the natural lip line, a technique Monroe herself had developed in collaboration with her personal makeup artist, Alan Whitey Snyder, who followed her career from 1946 to the end of her life. The overlip was so consistently applied and so publicly documented through photographs that it entered civilian beauty practice almost immediately, with women in Ohio and Georgia and Minnesota extending their Revlon cherries in the snow a precise millimetre past their own natural borders in deliberate homage. The Monroe lip overlay became one of the most replicated techniques in American beauty history and was achieved in domestic kitchens and office bathrooms with nothing more sophisticated than a steady hand and a mirror propped against a coffee tin. What both approaches shared was a fundamental understanding of what might be called the mobility problem. The challenge of producing a face that would hold its architecture through an 8-hour shooting day involving hot studio lights, emotional intensity, physical movement, and a California climate that in summer pushed makeup studios into temperatures well above what any powder formula had been designed to withstand. Max Factor had addressed this problem beginning in the 1920s with his grease paint reformulations, but by the 1950s, the challenge had moved from basic adhesion to something more nuanced, a face that held not just its pigment, but its dimensional illusion across every possible angle of a camera lens. The solution was layering, a sequence of products applied in a specific order, each creating a substrate for the next, the whole edifice as architecturally deliberate as the buildings going up in suburban Los Angeles in the same decade. Foundation first, liquid or cream, pressed into every surface crease to eliminate shadow differentiation. Then powder, setting the foundation chemically against the skin's natural oils, which would otherwise begin dissolving the pigment layer within an hour. Then the eye sequence. Liner first, applied as close to the lash line as possible, then shadow, then mascara. Always in that order, because shadow applied over liner dissolved the line's precision, while liner applied over shadow sat cleanly on a matte surface. Then the lip. Liner first, to establish the boundary, then colour, pressed into the liner rather than over it, because a lip filled from the inside out lasted twice as long as one painted in a single layer. Finally, a mist of setting spray, or, in the pre-setting spray era of the early 1950s, a careful pressing of a slightly dampened powder puff over the completed face, which set the surface without disturbing the layers beneath. The civilian translation of these techniques reached women through a specific and underappreciated distribution channel: the department store beauty counter. In cities across America, trained demonstrators employed by Max Factor, Revlon, and Helena Rubinstein set up camp behind glass cases of product and offered free consultations to any woman who stopped and looked. These demonstrators, who earned a base salary plus commission and were required to be both technically proficient and conversationally gifted, functioned as the bridge between Hollywood technique and domestic practice. A woman who came in asking for something to even out her complexion might leave 40 minutes later with a complete understanding of foundation application, powder placement, and the importance of blending, all of it demonstrated on her own face in the brightly lit mirror above the counter. The studio technique, filtered through the demonstrator's trained hands, became something a woman could reproduce at home on a Tuesday morning with a compact and 5 minutes. What neither the studio nor the department store counter could fully transmit was the more elusive element: the economy of motion, the practice fluency with which a woman who had been applying the same face for 15 years could reproduce it in near darkness, on a moving bus, in the 30 seconds before a business meeting began. That fluency was not something that could be taught in a demonstration. It accumulated through repetition, through failure, through the gradual discovery of which steps could be abbreviated and which were genuinely structural. A woman who had spent a decade watching herself in mirrors eventually understood her own face as a train she could navigate by memory. The mirror became secondary, the muscle memory became primary, and in the gap between those two states, between needing to see and knowing without looking, the whole secret of mid-century beauty practice lived. There was one detail buried in Wally Westmore's unpublished memoir notes held at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Library that illuminates this with unusual clarity. He wrote that after 20 years of working with Hollywood actresses, he could identify the ones who had become truly technically accomplished not by their results, which were universally excellent since they had professional assistants, but by the speed and confidence with which they touched up their own faces between takes. The actresses who had genuinely internalized the technique could walk to a production mirror, apply a single strategic press of powder, a half-second adjustment of lip color, and a brief reset of the under eye without pausing, without comparing the result to anything, without apparent uncertainty. They have, Westmore wrote, made the mirror optional. An optional mirror, as it turned out, was what the next 20 years of American women's lives would constantly require, because the luxury of time and reflection was not, in the 1950s, a guarantee that anyone had bothered to provision. The cinematographic revolution of the early 1950s created technical demands that fed back through the entire system of makeup product development in ways that have rarely been traced in full. When CinemaScope's expanded frame required more intensified facial presentation from performers, the makeup laboratories at Max Factor received detailed technical briefs from studio cinematographers specifying exactly which frequencies of light the new Eastman Color film stock captured differently from the older Technicolor process, and the product chemists adjusted their pigment formulations accordingly. The pancake that worked perfectly under the Technicolor system's 3-strip color separation process produced subtly different results under Eastman Color, requiring micro-adjustments in the yellow and orange pigment balance of specific shades to maintain the correct skin tone appearance on screen. These adjustments were communicated to the cosmetic retail divisions of Max Factor within approximately 18 months of the theatrical product reformulations, filtered, standardized, and made suitable for domestic use under bathroom and daylight illumination rather than studio Klieg lights, but still carrying the corrected color balance that had originated in the film laboratory. The department store demonstrators who served as the relay system between Hollywood technique and domestic practice were more technically sophisticated than their retail context suggested. Max Factor's demonstrator training program in the early 1950s required candidates to complete a 40-hour course in product chemistry, application technique, and color theory before they were permitted to work independently behind the counter. Helena Rubinstein's training was longer and more demanding, incorporating elements of what would now be recognized as formal esthetician training, skin analysis, understanding of product contraindications, the ability to assess a client's skin condition, and recommend appropriate products with the confidence of a clinical recommendation rather than a sales pitch. Elizabeth Arden's demonstrators were trained specifically in the Arden 8-hour philosophy of skin maintenance, a regimen Arden had developed in the 1930s based on her observation that skin repaired most actively during specific windows of the day. The knowledge these demonstrators carried into their conversations with department store shoppers represented, in aggregate, a significant transfer of professional beauty science into civilian practice, a transfer that happened not through magazines or advertising, but through the one-to-one conversation across a glass counter. The Hollywood influence on civilian makeup practice also operated through a second channel that is frequently overlooked, the Movie Fan magazine. Photoplay, Motion Picture, and Screen Stars published detailed beauty secrets features in virtually every issue, ghostwritten by the studio's publicity departments, but presented as candid personal revelations from the actresses themselves. These features described specific products by name, specific application techniques in enough detail to reproduce them, and specific daily routines with a precision that no general beauty editorial could match. A woman reading Photoplay's feature on Grace Kelly's skincare routine in March of 1955 received not just inspiration but instruction, an instruction calibrated to a specific ideal that was, in the context of the decade's aspirational culture, among the most powerful available. Something was changing, though, at the level of the eye specifically. Because if the lip was the symbol and the foundation was the armor, then the eye, particularly the eye with its precisely drawn line of liquid pigment, was becoming the weapon. And the story of that line begins with a Hungarian-born chemist in a New Jersey laboratory who could not quite get the formula right and would spend 7 years trying. The fact that Hazel Bishop, the chemist and entrepreneur who developed the first commercially successful long-wearing lipstick in 1950, simultaneously spent 6 years attempting to create a liquid eyeliner that would not dissolve in tears, is one of the great overlooked details of post-war American beauty history. Bishop's lip product had made her a millionaire by 1952. Her eyeliner research, conducted in a laboratory she maintained in a converted bathroom of her Tenafly, New Jersey apartment, produced, after numerous reformulations, a product that was technically adequate, but that she never regarded as quite finished. She filed a patent in 1954 and then watched as Revlon, with its superior distribution infrastructure and its relentless marketing apparatus, released a competing product that captured the market she had identified and bled her company nearly dry. The liner Hazel Bishop invented was better. The liner Charles Revson sold was everywhere. And that tension between innovation and visibility, between technical excellence and commercial power, runs like a dark thread through the entire history of the liquid liner and the eye aesthetic it created. The eye, in 1950s American beauty culture, was contested territory. The dominant aesthetic of the late 1940s had emphasized the lip above all other features, the deep, fully painted mouth that wartime photography had established as patriotic, defiant, and definitively adult. Lipstick was what the face was for. The eye was a supporting player, softened with a pale shadow, and occasionally defined with a pencil of no particular ambition. But several forces converged in the early years of the new decade to shift the emphasis upward, and those forces were not primarily cosmetic. They were architectural, psychological, and, in the most concrete possible terms, cinematic. The cinema screen of the 1950s was wider than it had been a decade earlier. CinemaScope, introduced in 1953 with The Robe, expanded the aspect ratio of the projected image from the old 4:3 Academy format to a panoramic 2.35:1, which meant that faces, for the first time in Hollywood history, occupied not the full frame but a portion of it, and that portion crucially included far more ambient context. Actresses whose expressions had previously read at maximum intensity in a close-up framing now needed to produce the same intensity with a face that occupied roughly a third less of the viewer's visual field. The solution that emerged from this technical challenge, developed collaboratively by cinematographers, makeup artists, and the actresses themselves, was the intensification of the eye. If the face was smaller in the frame, the eye had to work harder, and the instrument that made the eye work harder was the line. The line itself had a history that predated the 1950s by several millennia. Egyptian coal liner, applied to the upper and lower lids, served simultaneously as sun protection, spiritual significance, and social identification, a triple function that no amount of 20th century advertising would match for efficiency. The liquid formulations of the 1950s drew their chemical ancestry from India ink and theatrical spirit gum, reformulated with slightly less aggressive solvents to avoid the blistering that stage performers had historically accepted as a professional hazard. The earliest commercial liquid liners available in American drugstores in the late 1940s came in small glass bottles with a brush applicator designed for use by professional theatrical makeup artists, which meant that the brush was slightly stiff, the formula dried slowly, and any deviation of the hand while the formula was wet produced a smear that was essentially impossible to remove without starting the eye sequence from the beginning. Women who attempted these products in ordinary domestic conditions, bathroom mirrors fogged with morning steam, time measured in minutes rather than hours, hands that had already poured 3 bowls of cereal and located 1 missing shoe, did not find the experience encouraging. What changed the application experience was the felt tip. The precise origin of the felt tip liner is disputed among cosmetics historians, but the domestic American version, a product more analogous to a narrow marking pen than to the traditional brush applicator, began appearing in professional makeup kits in the early 1950s and in commercial retail in approximately 1955, with brands including Maybelline, Coty, and eventually Max Factor, each releasing variations in quick succession. The felt tip did something the brush could not. It deposited a consistent, controlled line at whatever pace the user moved it, rather than requiring the practitioner to maintain a constant hand pressure and brush angle simultaneously. The line could be thin, drawn at speed in a single confident stroke, or it could be built up in deliberate layers for the heavier, more theatrical effect that the early decade favoured. What mattered was that the felt tip was forgiving in a way that the brush applicator was not. It could be paused, repositioned, slightly corrected. It did not flood the lid with excess formula when the hand slowed down, and it dried in seconds. The winged extension, the flick, as British beauty journalists would come to call it, or the cat-eye wing in American usage, though the term cat-eye did not achieve widespread use until the late 50s, was a specific anatomical choice with specific optical consequences. The line extended past the outer corner of the eye in an upward direction, following the natural angle of the lower lash line extended outward and slightly elevated. The elevation was important. A wing drawn straight back from the outer corner, parallel to the lower lid, made the eye appear to droop. A wing angled upward at approximately 30 degrees made the outer corner appear to lift. The eye appear larger at its widest dimension, and the entire orbital structure appear slightly more symmetrical than it was in nature. Symmetry was the goal, not because symmetrical faces are more beautiful in any absolute aesthetic sense, but because the human visual system processes symmetry as health and vitality, a perception that no amount of cultural relativism has managed to significantly override. The social dimension of the winged liner was as carefully considered as the optical one. In the context of 1950s feminine presentation, where the rules governing what a woman could signal publicly through her appearance were both precise and unforgiving, the eye represented a specific degree of permissible expressiveness. A bold lip on a working woman in a business context in 1953 read, depending on the shade and the industry, as either professional or forward. A heavily cold eye on the same woman read as theatrical, aspirational, or in certain conservative environments as belonging to the wrong kind of woman entirely. But the liquid liner wing carefully applied occupied a middle territory. It was precise, which connoted discipline. It was narrow, which connoted restraint, and it was upswept, which connoted optimism. It was, in the parlance of the time, smart. It was the eye of a woman who knew what she was doing, and was doing it deliberately. The wing was not an accident. It was a decision. And in an era when women's decisions were heavily scrutinized, the ability to communicate decision-making and intentionality through a 3mm extension of black felt-tip formula on the outer corner of the upper eyelid was not trivial. The practice of the technique itself, the actual application under real domestic conditions, is where the story becomes most interesting, because it was in the application that the mirror question became truly acute. The winged liner demanded binocular stillness. To draw a line on a moving surface is ordinary. To draw a line on a moving surface while that surface is simultaneously trying to observe the drawing of the line is the specific comedy of liquid liner application that every woman who has ever attempted it knows intimately, and that no instruction sheet has ever fully solved. The eye must be relatively still, the lid must be slightly taut, the hand must be anchored against the cheek, against the temple, against some fixed structure that would reduce the transmission of pulse vibration to the brush tip. The mirror had to be at exactly the correct distance, too close, and the eye's natural defensive response caused tearing. Too far, and the precision of the line was impossible to verify in real time. What emerged from years of collective practice was a set of workarounds, shared between women with the specificity of technical knowledge, through beauty editors, through department store demonstrators, through older sisters and mothers who had been doing it longer. The elbow anchored on a hard surface, the little finger braced against the cheekbone, the eye half closed rather than fully open, the line drawn in 3 connected segments, inner corner to center, center to outer corner, wing extension, rather than in a single sweep, because a single sweep, while theoretically more elegant, was in practice achievable only by professionals with years of daily repetition. Most importantly, the liner applied first, before any other eye product, because foundation could be patched, powder could be touched up, mascara could be applied in stages, but a smeared liner required complete removal and restart. The liner was not forgiving of sequence errors. It rewarded preparation and punished impatience with a ruthlessness that felt almost personal. The women who had mastered it could touch it up in a car mirror, in a restaurant powder room, in the 2-minute pause between a meeting ending and a client entering. They had internalized the geometry of their own eyes so completely that the action required no more conscious attention than tying a shoe. The mirror confirmed, it did not guide. And confirmation, in matters of the 1950s eye, was almost always sufficient, because the woman who had drawn that wing 500 times knew, with a certainty that no reflection could improve upon, whether it was right. The technical challenge of the winged liner application was compounded by the specific physiological response that the eye produces in the presence of any instrument approaching its surface, the blink reflex, which is involuntary, and the tearing response, which in some women is almost continuous during application, and which deposits a moisture layer between the skin surface and the liner formula that can cause the line to bleed laterally rather than holding its position. Professional makeup artists working on film sets had access to proprietary pharmaceutical solutions, mild anesthetic drops and astringent solutions that temporarily suppressed both the blink reflex and the tear production that were explicitly not available in civilian retail. Women applying their own liner at home under real domestic conditions managed these physiological challenges through the same mechanism that managed every other precision task in the 1950s household: repetition, patience, and the gradual development of a personal technique adapted to their specific physiological tendencies. The specific social history of the winged liner is inseparable from the history of the actress Audrey Hepburn, whose appearance in Roman Holiday in 1953 introduced to American audiences a version of the winged liner that differed in specific ways from the dominant mid-decade application. The Hepburn liner was narrower, more precisely placed along the upper lash line, without the heavier build-up of shadow beneath it that characterized the Marilyn Monroe eye, and extended in a wing that was longer relative to the lid than was typical for the period, extending the eye's apparent length rather than its height. The result was an eye that read as simultaneously larger and more elongated, creating the distinctive Hepburn facial geometry that cinematographers and makeup artists of the period discussed in genuinely technical terms as a problem of optical correction. Hepburn's eyes, photographically, were too wide set for conventional close-up composition, and the extended horizontal line of her liner compensated for this by drawing the viewer's gaze laterally rather than concentrically. The civilian adaptation of the Hepburn liner arrived through the fashion magazines within approximately 6 months of Roman Holiday's theatrical release, translated into instructions sufficiently generalized to apply to women who did not share Hepburn's specific facial geometry. What survived the translation was the principle of the extended horizontal line, longer, thinner, more precisely placed than the heavier, more theatrical liner of the early decade. By 1955, the dominant liner aesthetic in American women's magazines had shifted perceptibly toward this more refined application, and the product formulations available at drugstore counters had evolved to meet it. The felt tip applicator that delivered a fine, consistent line had largely displaced the older brush applicator in mass-market products, though professional and salon brands retained the brush for women who had mastered its use and preferred the control it provided for more detailed work. But the eye and the lip were not the only territories requiring management. Below the neck, a different kind of structural ambition was taking shape, one that had nothing to do with colour or line, and everything to do with the slow, deliberate chemistry of what a woman put into her body rather than onto her face. In 1953, the Knox Gelatin Company, founded in the 1870s by Charles Knox, who had built his fortune convincing Victorian housewives that the labour of boiling calves' feet could be replaced by a packet of purified animal collagen, ran a full-page advertisement in Ladies' Home Journal featuring a photograph of a trim, elegantly dressed woman standing beside a gleaming refrigerator. The text beside her read, in part, "Knox unflavoured gelatine, for a slimmer, lovelier you." The caloric content of a Knox gelatin serving was approximately 36 calories. The promised transformation, a slimmer, lovelier woman, implied by proximity to the refrigerator and the word "you," was made without any further qualification, because the Federal Trade Commission's advertising oversight in 1953 had not yet developed the vocabulary to question such constructions. The Knox advertisement was not unusual. It was entirely representative of a decade in which the relationship between food, body, beauty, and self-worth had been compressed into a set of formulas so simplified that they constituted, in retrospect, a mass exercise in nutritional mythology shared by an entire generation of women who were simultaneously better educated and more misinformed about their own bodies than any preceding generation in American history. The 1950s were not the beginning of American diet culture. The late 19th century had produced Horace Fletcher, who advocated for chewing each mouthful of food exactly 32 times before swallowing. The early 20th century had produced Lulu Hunt Peters, whose 1917 book Diet and Health, with Key to the Calories, is generally recognized as the founding text of the modern calorie-counting movement. But the post-war decade supercharged diet culture with a set of accelerants that earlier eras had lacked. The mass-market women's magazine with its simultaneous beauty editorial and food advertising, the explosion of television advertising that placed body ideals in living rooms 5 nights a week, and the specific cultural pressure of the post-war suburban ideal, the returning soldier's wife, slender and welcoming and domestically accomplished, who was somehow expected to produce elaborate multi-course dinners, while herself remaining at the figure she'd maintained as a 20-year-old bride. Gelatin was the decade's dominant dietary technology because it satisfied several requirements at once that no other product in the market could claim simultaneously. It was cheap. A box of Knox cost less than 15 cents and could produce enough molds to constitute multiple servings. It was visually spectacular. A properly set aspic or a molded dessert presented at a dinner table demonstrated technical skill and aesthetic ambition in a form that guests could admire before they ate it. It was, in the language of the period, filling without being fattening, a concept that nutrition science has since complicated, but that the 1950s housewife accepted with the same unquestioning faith she brought to her physician's recommendation to smoke a cigarette to settle her nerves. And it was, critically, compatible with the social forms of the decade. You could serve gelatin to guests. You could bring it to a church social. You could present it to a mother-in-law as evidence of both culinary competence and healthy self-management, those two virtues travelling together in mid-century domestic presentation as inseparably as gloves and a handbag. The range of things that were suspended in gelatin moulds in the American home kitchen of the 1950s represents a category of culinary ambition that later decades found impossible to evaluate without condescension, and that condescension has tended to obscure how systematically these recipes were promoted, and how thoroughly they were embedded in a specific theory of nutrition that was, in its own terms, internally consistent. Lime gelatin with cream cheese and crushed pineapple was a dessert, sweet, refreshing, and understood to be a lighter alternative to the cake it replaced. Tomato aspic with embedded cucumber and celery was a salad, presented on a lettuce leaf with a dollop of mayonnaise that undermined its caloric ambition, but that the cook often elected to regard as structural rather than caloric. The crown jewel of the aspic era was the full dinner in gelatin, meat stock set with vegetables and occasionally a protein component such as canned tuna or hard-boiled eggs, presented on a platter with the confidence of a centerpiece. These were not failed attempts at normal food. They were technically accomplished products of a specific culinary philosophy that understood lightness as virtue and density as indulgence. Alongside gelatin, the decade produced a remarkable variety of diet theories, each with its own proprietary publication, celebrity endorser, or physician advocate. The Prudent Diet, developed by Dr. Norman Jolliffe of the New York City Department of Health, beginning in 1957, emphasized the substitution of polyunsaturated fats for saturated ones, an approach that was ahead of its time biochemically, but that translated in practice into a great deal of margarine on everything, including things on which margarine had no apparent business appearing. The Stillman diet, developed by Dr. Irwin Stillman in the early 60s but rooted in nutritional thinking, current throughout the 50s, prescribed high protein, high water intake, and the elimination of fats and carbohydrates, the first formal incarnation of what would later resurface, under various names, in every decade through the present. The Hollywood diet, which arrived in the early 50s in thin booklet form sold at newsstands for a quarter, prescribed a 12-day regimen of grapefruit, eggs, lean protein, and green vegetables, with a coffee allowance that made the regimen physiologically survivable for women who required caffeine to manage the combination of caloric deficit and domestic labour. The tomato juice regimen deserves specific attention, because it appears in so many women's personal accounts of the decade that it constitutes something close to a collective memory. A glass of tomato juice. V8 was the premium commercial option, though many women squeezed their own from canned tomatoes strained through cheesecloth. At breakfast, sometimes augmented with a raw egg yolk beaten into it in the manner of a very austere cocktail, was understood to provide vitamins, to suppress appetite through the combination of mild acidity and modest protein, and to constitute proof of self-discipline visible to no one but the woman herself, and whatever family member happened to be in the kitchen at 7 in the morning. The tomato juice was not primarily about nutrition, though women invoke nutrition to justify it. It was primarily about intention. A woman who drank tomato juice at breakfast had already made a decision about her day before the day had fully begun. The decision was legible to herself in the colour of what was in the glass. The connection between this intense dietary management and the world of the beauty counter, the vanity table, and the makeup routine was not merely cultural proximity. It was explicit and direct, and the women's magazine was the instrument of the connection. A single issue of Vogue or Harper's Bazaar in 1954 might contain an article on foundation for dry skin, dryness being a consequence of caloric restriction that no dermatologist of the period was yet connecting to diet. An advertisement for a calorie-counting manual available by mail order, a recipe for a gelatin mold that served 8 and contained 300 total calories, and a fashion spread featuring models whose measurements had been included in the caption, 35, 22, 35, as though these numbers were as natural to include as the name of the designer. The woman reading this magazine was simultaneously a body to be clothed, a skin to be tended, a stomach to be managed, and a household to be fed. The sheer administrative complexity of these simultaneous demands was not discussed in the magazine, it was simply assumed. What the dieting literature of the 1950s never addressed, and what has only in recent decades been recuperated through the work of feminist historians and sociologists of medicine, was the physical impact of chronic mild undernutrition on the ability to perform the very tasks the decade demanded most of women. The steady hand required for liquid liner, the focused attention required for intricate hair setting, the social competence required for a dinner party at which the hostess appeared effortless while managing 6 courses and 12 conversational currents simultaneously. The woman who had lived on tomato juice and gelatin for 4 days running was operating on a physiological substrate that did not support peak performance at any of these tasks, and yet the performance was expected to be seamless. The face was expected to be flawless. The hair was expected to hold. The connection between what she ate and how she looked was made constantly, in advertising and editorial, in ways that position nutrition as the servant of appearance. The connection between what she ate and how she functioned, cognitively, emotionally, physically, was made nowhere at all. The gelatin mold set and trembled. The tomato juice sat in its glass. The woman in the magazine advertisement stood beside her gleaming refrigerator, slimmer and lovelier, her face composed and her posture perfect. Outside the frame, her hands may have been shaking slightly, but she knew from long practice how to hold a brush steady when her hand shook. She'd learned that particular skill from the same place she had learned everything else about the maintenance of her appearance under adverse conditions. From years of repetition, in the morning, before anyone else was awake, with the mirror propped on the bathroom counter and the alarm clock ticking. The social performance of dietary restraint in the 1950s operated through mechanisms that were simultaneously intimate and highly public, and the most revealing of these mechanisms was the cocktail party canapé. The small, elaborately prepared appetizers that circulated on silver trays at the suburban dinner party, the stuffed mushroom, the cheese straw, the deviled egg, the cucumber round with its cream cheese and smoked salmon crown, represented a specific negotiation between the hostess's ambition and her guest's self-management. The hostess was expected to produce food that demonstrated skill, care, and abundance. The guests, particularly the female guests, were expected to consume it with a selectivity that demonstrated self-control. A woman who ate freely and enthusiastically at a cocktail party in 1953 was, in the social calculus of the decade, making a statement about her relationship to discipline that was read as clearly as the hemline of her skirt. The intersection between dietary culture and cosmetic culture was most visible in the advertising that appeared in the same magazines and on the same pages. A woman reading the October 1953 issue of Ladies' Home Journal would encounter, within a dozen pages, an advertisement for foundation garments promising to reduce the appearance of the figure by 3 inches, an article on the new calorie counting methods being promoted by the American Medical Association, a recipe for a gelatin dessert featuring a meringue crown that required 45 minutes to prepare and contained 62 calories per serving, and a beauty editorial recommending a specific foundation formulation for the delicate skin that the editorial attributed, without irony, to a diet rich in vitamins and light on fatty foods. The woman who read all 4 of these items in sequence absorbed a message about her body that was more comprehensive than any single one of them contained. The ideal female body was one that had been systematically managed, through both external and internal means, toward a standard that required constant maintenance and that was never quite achieved. The achievement was always pending, the effort was always required, and the effort was, by the logic of the era, evidence of character. The psychological dimension of mid-century diet culture has been extensively analysed in the decades since, but one aspect of it tends to remain under-examined: the specific pleasure that the ritual of dietary management could provide in a decade that offered women very few culturally legitimated forms of agency. The decision to eat the tomato juice instead of the eggs, to make the gelatin mould instead of the pastry, to count the calories rather than merely estimate them. These were small, daily exercises of control in a domestic environment where the larger structural decisions were almost entirely determined by other people. A woman who could not choose her own career, who could not easily access credit in her own name, who was expected to defer to her husband on major household decisions, could nevertheless choose what she put in her own body with a granularity and deliberateness that no external authority could prevent. The diet was, among other things, a domain of self-governance, and the record of it, the calorie log, the weekly weigh-in, the dress that fits slightly better, was a form of testimony to her own effectiveness as an agent in the world. The hair, though, the hair was another matter entirely, because hair did not respond to discipline the way skin did. Hair had its own physics. And the woman of the 1950s had developed, over years of patient experimentation, a set of techniques for managing those physics that constituted one of the most sophisticated applications of mechanical engineering ever performed in a residential bathroom. The tensile strength of a properly set pin curl in 1954 was, under ideal conditions, sufficient to survive 8 hours of sleep without losing more than 20% of its curl amplitude, a specification that sounds like it belongs in an engineering manual, which is approximately what the pin curl instruction pamphlets of the period actually were, dressed in the typographic conventions of the women's magazine. The mathematics underlying the curl were precise. The diameter of the curl determined the size of the finished wave. The direction of the curl determined the direction of the finished movement, and the tension applied during setting determined the longevity of the result. A woman who understood these variables and applied them consistently could produce, every morning, a head of hair so architecturally specific and so reliably reproducible that the finished result was effectively identical from one week to the next. A woman who set her hair by instinct without the engineering framework would produce results that varied with the humidity, the quality of her setting lotion, and the specific disposition of her crown section on any given evening. Both women, in the morning light, could look equally beautiful. But only one of them knew why it had worked. The pin curl tradition in America had deep roots in the theatrical and professional grooming culture of the early 20th century, when elaborate coiffures required daily maintenance by skilled hairdressers who understood the physics of wave formation before the vocabulary of physics had been made accessible to general readers. The Marcel wave, introduced in France in the 1870s by hairdresser Marcel Gratteau using a heated iron, had established the principle that artificially induced curl was desirable and achievable, and had prompted decades of experimentation with heat-based setting. But heat setting carried obvious risks: the scorched hair of the early permanent wave era, the chemical burns of the first sodium hydroxide straightening treatments, the general understanding that aggressive thermal processing produced short-term compliance and long-term fragility. The pin curl, by contrast, was a cold process. It applied no heat, no chemicals beyond a mild setting lotion, and no mechanical force beyond the tension of the curl itself. It was, in this sense, the gentlest of all available wave-setting techniques, and the one most compatible with the frequency of use that the 1950s standards of daily presentation demanded. The tools of the pin curl ritual were simple and specific. Setting lotion, Tony, Lilt, or Luster cream were the dominant brands, though women with access to professional products sometimes used a diluted gum solution, borrowed from their hairdresser's supply closet, was applied to damp, freshly shampooed hair in sections, combed through to distribute evenly from root to tip. The lotion functioned as a temporary plasticizer, softening the hydrogen bonds in the hair shaft and allowing the cortex to assume whatever shape it was held in while drying. Once the lotion was distributed, the sectioning began. The crown section was divided from the sides at approximately the crest of the head. The sides were divided from the nape at the occipital bone. The nape section was addressed first, then the sides, then the crown. This sequence was not arbitrary. The nape was the section most likely to resist curl formation, having the densest hair and the shortest natural wave pattern in most women. Setting it first, while the lotion was freshest and the hair most pliable, gave it the longest drying time which it required. The crown curls, being finer and more cooperative in most hair types, could be set last and would hold adequately with a shorter setting time. Each individual curl was formed by winding a section of hair, the size of the section determining, as noted, the diameter of the finished wave. Around 2 fingers, then slipping the resulting circle from the fingers onto the scalp and securing it with a single wave clip, a metal clip with 2 parallel tines that pinched the curl against its own base without deforming the shape. The direction of the winding mattered. Forward wound curls produced a wave that flowed toward the face. Backward wound curls produced a wave that flowed away from it. Alternating forward and backward, curls in adjacent rows produced the sculpture wave effect, a flowing directional movement that suggested controlled casualness, an effect that required roughly 45 minutes to produce and 0 minutes to explain, because women did not explain their hair to each other any more than they explained their breathing. The knowledge was transmitted laterally, through observation and replication, a younger woman watching an older woman's hands, then reproducing the motion until her own hands knew it without instruction. The setting lotion brands each had proprietary formulations that devotees swore by with the conviction of religious adherence. Tony, a Gillette subsidiary by the 1950s, offered a range of setting products calibrated to different hair types: fine, medium, coarse, and hair conditions, dry, oily, chemically treated. Its advertising used the twin sisters device. Two identical women, one professionally styled, one home-styled using Tony. The reader challenged to determine which was which. The implication was clear. The home technique, properly executed, was indistinguishable from the salon result. This was not entirely dishonest. A skilled woman setting her own hair with Tony on a Saturday evening and brushing it out on Sunday morning could achieve a result that, in terms of wave definition and longevity, genuinely rivaled what a salon could produce, at approximately 1/10 the cost, and with the additional dividend of having been achieved in her own bathroom at 11 o'clock at night while listening to the radio. The drying period, the hours between completing the set and brushing out the result, was the interval most subject to negotiation in the 1950s household. Women who set their hair on Saturday afternoon could allow a full 4 to 6 hours of ambient air drying before the Saturday evening social engagement that was the most common prompt for the ritual. Women who set on weeknights had two options: the sitting under a hood dryer approach, which required either a visit to a salon or the possession of one of the portable home dryers that began appearing in American households in the early 1950s, or the overnight approach, which required sleeping on the set with sufficient protective apparatus to arrive at morning with the curls structurally intact. The overnight approach was the more common and the more technically demanding. The sleeping cap, a hairnet, a bandana tied over the pin curls, or in the most elaborate version, a quilted satin sleep bonnet purchased from a beauty supply shop, served as the first line of defense against the mechanical flattening that occurred when a woman's head, weighing approximately 10 to 12 pounds, contacted a pillow for 7 hours. Even with the cap, the side on which a woman slept would exhibit more compression than the opposite side, a disparity that required specific remediation during the morning brush-out. Experienced practitioners would deliberately set the side they habitually slept on with tighter, more numerous curls than the other side, knowing from years of observation that the compression would reduce the final amplitude to match the less compressed side. This adjustment was not written down anywhere. It was personal, empirical, and individually calibrated, the kind of knowledge that could not be transmitted through a magazine article, because it depended on variables specific to each woman's hair, skull, and sleeping habits. The morning brush-out was the ceremony that justified all of it. The pins removed one by one, the clips placed in a dish or a glass on the vanity, the hair released in tight individual spirals that bore no apparent resemblance to the finished result. This was the moment of apparent chaos before coherence. A wide-toothed comb was sometimes used first to loosen the curls from each other, though many women skipped this step entirely and went directly to the brush. The brush was a boar bristle instrument, preferably with a rubber cushion pad that allowed the bristles to flex rather than drag, and it moved through the hair in long sweeping strokes from root to tip in the direction of the desired finished wave. The physics of this step were counterintuitive. Tighter curls, brushed through, produced softer waves because the brush action blended adjacent curl formations into a continuous movement rather than leaving them as separate spirals. 40 pin curls brushed together produced one flowing coiffure. The transformation occurred in the brushing. The durability of the finished style depended on the quality of the setting and the humidity of the ambient environment. In the compressed summer humidity of the American Midwest, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, where so much of the 1950s domestic story unfolded, a perfectly set and brushed style had a functional lifespan of approximately 4 to 6 hours, before the hydrogen bonds, rebroken by atmospheric moisture, began releasing the curl to its natural state. Women in these climates had developed an entire secondary vocabulary of fixative products, Aquanet, Spraynet, Helen Curtis spray, that sealed the surface of the brush style against humidity infiltration at the cost of a certain stiffness that later decades would find characteristic of the era, though in its own time it was understood simply as the necessary price of coherence. The specific set of products supporting the pin curl ritual represented one of the earliest examples of what would later be recognized as the beauty system, a range of complementary products designed to be used in sequence each creating the conditions for the next to function optimally. Setting lotion prepared the hair for the mechanical set. The metal clips held the set. The sleeping cap preserved it. The net bag kept the clips from tangling. The hairbrush performed the finish. And the final step, a light mist of lacquer, sealed the finished style against the environmental forces that would otherwise begin dissolving it within the hour. The Tony Company, which understood this system architecture intuitively from its experience producing home permanent wave kits, organized its full product range around exactly this sequential logic, and its catalogues of the period read like instruction manuals for a specific domestic manufacturing process. The home permanent wave, which had existed in various forms since the 1920s, but reached its mass-market American peak in the late 1940s and early 50s with the Tony kit, represented a specific intersection between professional technique and domestic ambition that was characteristic of the period. The Tony system used a two-solution chemical process, a reducing agent that broke the sulfur bonds in the hair shaft, applied while the hair was wound on rods, followed after a specific interval by a neutralizer that reformed those bonds in the new position, to produce a durable wave pattern that lasted approximately 6 to 8 weeks. The chemistry involved was, in the pure technical sense, identical to what a salon permanent used. Tony's genius was not the chemistry, but the packaging, the instruction manual, and the Tony Twins advertising campaign that made a salon-quality result feel accessible rather than aspirational. The Tony Home Permanent sold more kits in 1951 than any other hair product in the American market, and it sold them to women who were, for the first time, performing salon-quality chemical treatments on each other's hair in kitchen chairs with a confidence that previous generations had reserved exclusively for professionals. The relationship between the pin curl ritual and the permanent wave was complementary rather than exclusive. Women who wore a permanent set their between salon growth with pin curls between appointments, using the mechanical set to maintain the wave definition that the chemical set was gradually releasing. Women who could not afford regular salon permanents used pin curls exclusively, and some of these women produced results indistinguishable from a chemically processed curl, given sufficient skill in the setting technique and the right quality of setting lotion. The distinction between the permanently waved woman and the pin-curled woman was, to the observer, invisible, which was precisely the cultural point that the Tony Twins advertisements had made so effectively. The beauty of a properly executed pin curl set was that it was, in the finished state, silent about the effort it had required. The discipline remained in the private hours between the bedroom door closing and the morning alarm. A woman who had set and brushed her hair competently did not need to check it obsessively through the morning. She knew it was right because she had done it right. The mirror in this case was a starting point, not a destination. What she used from that point forward was not her eyes, but her hands. The light touch of fingertips at the crown to confirm a curl's position, the slight pat at the temple to redirect a wave that had shifted slightly in the course of the morning. These were tactile adjustments, performable without stopping, without deviation from whatever else she was doing, without the architecture of the ritual requiring any visible interruption. The hair was finished, the eye was next, and while the hair had required preparation, patience, and a specific kind of structural intelligence, the world she was about to enter required something that no setting lotion and no boar bristle brush could provide: the right words, in the right sequence, delivered with the right inflection. That required a different kind of practice altogether. Patricia Stevens was 31 years old in 1950 when she opened the first Patricia Stevens Career College and Modeling School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and she operated with a philosophy so direct it bordered on confrontational. Any woman, regardless of her natural attributes, could be trained to present herself in public with the composure, precision, and apparent effortlessness of a finishing school graduate. And the women most in need of that training were not the awkward or the shy, but the intelligent and ambitious ones, who had spent their formative years valuing their minds over their exteriors, and had arrived at adulthood without the social grammar that their less intellectually focused counterparts had absorbed through years of deliberate feminine performance. Stevens's insight was not that brains and beauty were incompatible. It was that brains and beauty were both skills, and that the second was as learnable as the first, and as useful, and that failing to develop it was not modesty but strategic negligence. By 1958, the Patricia Stevens Career College had franchised to over 100 locations across the United States and Canada. The textbook she developed for the curriculum, the Patricia Stevens Complete Book of Fashion and Charm, sold over 300,000 copies. The book balanced well on the head. The book balancing exercise, which has become the single most iconic and most frequently satirized element of finishing school culture, was not, in the context of its original purpose, an exercise in absurdity. It was a posture diagnostic. A book placed on the crown of the head will fall unless the spine is vertical, the shoulders are set back, and the neck is extended rather than compressed forward, which is to say, unless the body is in the alignment that most anatomy textbooks describe as mechanically optimal for long-term musculoskeletal health. The balance exercise was a biofeedback mechanism. It provided immediate, unambiguous information about spinal alignment that no amount of verbal instruction could deliver with the same precision. A woman who could walk across a room carrying a copy of The Importance of Being Earnest on her head without steadying it with her hands had, in the precise biomechanical sense, good posture. A woman who could not had specific information about which part of her spine or shoulder girdle required attention. The absurdity was a cultural overlay, applied in retrospect, that tells us more about how later decades chose to regard the feminine disciplines of the 50s than about the disciplines themselves. The posture component of the charm school curriculum connected directly to the presentation of clothing, and this connection was not merely aesthetic, though it was that too. A pencil skirt of the 1950s, constructed with virtually no ease through the hips and a hemline that fell to mid-calf or below, required a specific walking technique that was effectively impossible to perform with poor posture. The short, forward-directed steps that the silhouette demanded were mechanically efficient only when the pelvis was in neutral alignment and the spine was vertical. A woman who thrust her head forward or rounded her upper back would find that the skirt prevented the natural forward swing of the leg and produced a gait that, in addition to appearing awkward, was genuinely inefficient. The charm school's insistence on posture was, among other things, a course in how to walk in the clothes that the decade required, which is to say, a course in practical anatomy, taught without anatomical vocabulary, by women who had learned it from women who had learned it from the theatrical tradition. The grammar of the parlour room introduction, who was introduced to whom, in which order, and with what formulaic language, occupied a significant portion of the charm school curriculum and strikes the contemporary reader as so hopelessly archaic that it requires a small act of imaginative reconstruction to understand why it mattered. The social introduction in the 1950s was not merely a pleasantry, it was a navigational instrument. In a social landscape where a woman's marriage, employment, and social advancement all depended significantly on the impression she made in the early seconds of an initial encounter, the quality of her introductions, including whether she extended her hand, to whom she extended it first, whether she rose from a seated position, and precisely what she said as she did so, functioned as a kind of social passport, instantly legible to others who had been trained in the same code, and equally instantly legible as deficient to those who had been trained to notice deficiency. The content of the conversational curriculum is worth examining in detail because it reveals, with unusual clarity, the specific social anxieties the decade was managing. Patricia Stevens's course, and those of her competitors, including the Barbizon School of Modelling and the John Robert Powers Agency's training programs, devoted substantial time to what they called conversational boundaries, not restrictions on what women could discuss, but guidance on the navigation of sensitive territories in mixed social company. The recommended approach to politics was express interest in the speaker's position, ask clarifying questions, and avoid expressing your own position directly in any company where it might be contentious. The recommended approach to personal finances was never discuss your own income, never inquire about others, and respond to direct inquiries with a change of subject so smooth that the inquirer would not notice it had occurred. The recommended approach to other women's husbands was compliment specific achievements in professional or domestic terms, avoid complimenting personal appearance, and remember the names of children, as men invariably responded to the evidence that a woman had retained information about their family as though it were a compliment directed at themselves. These were not, in the most fundamental sense, rules about politeness. They were rules about power, specifically about how a woman with limited institutional power could maximize her social effectiveness within a system that had not been designed to accommodate her ambitions. The charm school taught, in the language of poise and deportment, a set of techniques for navigating rooms full of people who held considerably more structural authority than the woman doing the navigating, and it taught these techniques as reflexes, as behaviors so thoroughly rehearsed that they became automatic responses, available at any moment, in any social context, without requiring the conscious allocation of attention that deliberate strategy would demand. A woman who had to think about whether to rise from her chair when being introduced would perform the action slightly too late, which would be noticed. A woman who had rehearsed the action 500 times would perform it with the smooth immediacy that reads as natural, which, in social performance as in cosmetic performance, was always the objective. The tactile disciplines of the charm school intersected with the cosmetic disciplines of the vanity table at a specific and underappreciated point, the handshake. A woman's handshake in 1954 was a document of self-presentation, as legible as her foundation application. Too limp, and she communicated either diffidence or condescension. There was a school of thought in this period that women deliberately extended soft, boneless hands to men as a form of submission, and another school of thought that they did so from ignorance, and the charm school curriculum explicitly addressed both interpretations. The grip was to be firm without being challenging, a precise calibration that required practice, because the natural grip of most untrained adult women had been shaped by years of handshakes in female company, where the social stakes of the gesture were lower, and the grip itself had drifted toward whatever was comfortable, rather than whatever was strategic. The make-up component of the charm school curriculum was taught in a single dedicated session at most schools, lasting approximately 2 hours, and it was framed explicitly as a social grace rather than a cosmetic technique. The emphasis was not on how to create a particular look, but on how to maintain and repair a look in public with the minimum expenditure of visible effort. Foundation once applied was to be refreshed only with powder, never by applying additional foundation in public, which was considered as inappropriate as touching up with the original cosmetic equivalent of repainting a wall with a full roller when a touch-up brush would have served. Lipstick was to be applied in the powder room, never at the table. But the teacher who communicated this rule also made a point of teaching how to apply lipstick from memory, without a mirror, in the event that the powder room was occupied, and the occasion was not one that permitted delay. The technique was simple in theory, and difficult in practice. Apply to the lower lip first, pressing the lips together twice to transfer colour to the upper lip, then correct with the ring finger if necessary. No outliner, no mirror. Confidence and muscle memory. These were the instruments. The charm school's larger project, and this becomes clear when you read the curriculum documents rather than the publicity materials, was the development of a specific kind of cognitive style. Not the style of the strategist, who plans and adjusts and operates with visible deliberation. The style of the expert, who has so thoroughly internalized the relevant knowledge that its application appears effortless, natural, and essentially involuntary. The woman who had completed the charm school curriculum was not supposed to appear trained. She was supposed to appear natural. And the distance between those two appearances, between the trained and the naturally gracious, was exactly the length of the practice required to close it. The physical disciplines of the charm school curriculum extended beyond posture into the management of the entire body in social space, what the French would call the habitus of class, though Patricia Stevens's course materials use the more accessible term poise, which they defined, with unusual precision, as the appearance of comfort in every physical situation, regardless of the actual level of comfort present. The distinction was important and deliberate. Poise was not the absence of discomfort. It was the trained management of the expression of discomfort, the ability to sit in a chair that was too low, or to wear shoes that were slightly too tight, or to hold a cocktail glass during an extended conversation when one's arm was beginning to tire, without any of these facts becoming visible to the people one was talking with. This capacity, call it social stoicism or trained composure, was, the curriculum argued, not merely aesthetically desirable, but practically essential in a professional and social landscape, where the display of discomfort was interpreted as evidence of unfamiliarity with the setting. A woman who shifted in her chair was a woman who did not belong in the chair. A woman who held it perfectly still communicated through that stillness a claim to the space she occupied, the voice curriculum, which receiving schools and charm courses treated with nearly as much attention as posture and presentation, focused on the specific phonetic and tonal qualities that mid-century American social convention associated with intelligence, education, and social background. The Barbizon School's voice training materials from this period are remarkable documents. They provide, in systematic detail, instructions for lowering the habitual pitch of the speaking voice by approximately 2 tones from whatever the student's natural resting pitch might be, for eliminating regional accent features that might place the speaker in a specific geographic and therefore socio-economic context, and for developing what the materials called variety, the controlled modulation of pitch and pace that prevents a speaking voice from reading as monotonous while maintaining the register of composed authority. The women who completed this training and then encountered it again in their own daughters' drama classes a decade later would have recognized immediately that what they had been taught was not social grace, but professional-grade voice work. The distinction between the finishing school graduate and the trained actress was, in this specific domain, narrower than either institution preferred to acknowledge. The etiquette of the telephone call occupied a dedicated session in most charm school curricula of the period, which tells you something specific about how thoroughly communications technology had embedded itself in the fabric of middle-class social life by the mid-1950s. The standard guidance, announce yourself by name at the beginning of every call rather than waiting to be identified, limits social calls to a prescribed duration that varied by the relationship and the time of day. Never telephone after 9 o'clock in the evening under any circumstance that was not a genuine emergency, reflects a moment when telephone use was still governed by conventions borrowed from formal social correspondence, conventions that were already beginning to dissolve at the edges under the pressure of a technology that made instantaneous casual communication possible for the first time in human history. The women who completed these courses and applied these conventions to their daily telephone interactions were, without necessarily recognizing it, performing an act of cultural conservation, maintaining the forms of a social world whose foundations were already shifting beneath them. That the compact and the powder room were both instruments and destinations in this social cartography was not coincidental. The compact was portable authority, and in the hands of a woman who understood what she was carrying, it was something considerably more interesting than a case for cosmetic powder. In 1951, a Stratton compact manufactured in Birmingham, England, a circular case in gold-plated brass with a painted enamel lid depicting a spray of roses in coral and ivory, retailed in American department stores for $4.75. The powder it contained cost approximately 30 cents to produce. The compact itself, the physical object, the hinged brass case with its beveled mirror and its powder puff anchored by a satin ribbon loop, represented the remaining $4.45 of the purchase, and represented, in the economy of mid-century women's cosmetic culture, something that the word container entirely fails to capture. Because what a woman purchased when she purchased a Stratton compact was not merely a vessel for pressed powder. She was purchasing a piece of personal architecture, an object designed to be seen in the act of use, an instrument of social display as deliberately constructed as the architecture of the parlour room in which she would use it. The compact was a communication device, and like all communication devices, it was legible at a distance. The Stratton Manufacturing Company of Birmingham had been producing compacts since 1942, and its rise to dominance in the American market during the 1950s was a function of two intersecting factors: the quality of its metal work, which was genuinely superior to most domestic American production of the period, and the timing of its expanded American distribution, which coincided almost exactly with the post-war surge in female consumer spending that cosmetics companies had been carefully tracking since 1946. Stratton's distinctive hinged mechanism, a spring-loaded double-hinge system that allowed the compact to open completely flat and remain there without requiring the user to hold it open, was patented and therefore exclusive, and it solved a specific practical problem that every other compact on the market had left unaddressed: the mirror that tilts away from you at the moment you most need it stable. The Stratton opened and stayed open, at the angle you placed it, until you closed it yourself. In the context of a moving automobile or a restaurant table with limited flat surface, this was not a minor convenience. It was, for the woman who used a compact regularly in public, a minor but significant technology. The enamel work on Stratton's premium line drew from the tradition of English cloisonné that had been producing decorative enamel objects since the 16th century, and the specific designs of the 1950s production: roses, peacocks, hunting scenes, abstract geometric patterns in the primary colours of the decade's graphic design vocabulary, have been reproduced so extensively in subsequent decades that it has become difficult to distinguish the original productions from the later replications without examining the hinge mechanism and the weight distribution of the case. Original Stratton compacts of the early to mid-1950s have a specific heft in the hand. The gold plating over a brass substrate is thicker than later production standards, and the mirror glass is heavier than the acrylic panels used in 1960s and later products, and that heft was not incidental. It was part of the message the compact communicated when it appeared on a restaurant table or was retrieved from an evening bag in a theatre lobby. Weight, in an era before the cultural appreciation for lightness had permeated product design, communicated value. A heavy compact said, "I did not buy the cheapest option available." The public use of the compact was governed by a set of conventions that varied somewhat by region, class, and setting, but shared a common underlying principle. The compact was an instrument of brief, purposeful, visible self-maintenance, not of extended grooming. To open a compact and conduct a lengthy inspection of one's face at a restaurant table was, in the etiquette framework of the period, as inappropriate as brushing one's hair at the table, an act so comprehensively prohibited that it did not even require explicit instruction, because no woman of the relevant social class would have needed to be told. What was permitted, and in many social contexts positively received as evidence of self-possession, was the brief, efficient deployment of the compact for a specific and visible purpose: a light pressing of powder to the nose and forehead to eliminate shine, a check of the lip line before coffee was served, a half-second confirmation that the eye had not smudged in the warmth of the restaurant. These were legitimate uses. They were also performances in the theatrical sense, demonstrations of the woman's relationship to her own appearance conducted in the presence of others, interpreted by those others as evidence of character. Helena Rubinstein understood the compact's social function with extraordinary precision. Her design collaborations — she commissioned compact cases from artists including Erte and Salvador Dalí in the 1920s and 30s, and continued to regard the compact as an art object throughout her career — positioned the Rubinstein compact in a category adjacent to jewelry rather than to drugstore product. A Rubinstein compact was not a vessel for powder. It was a miniature sculpture, designed to be seen as well as used, to communicate the owner's aesthetic sensibility as well as her grooming habits. Elizabeth Arden's approach was more restrained but equally deliberate. Her compact cases, in the pale pink and gold that constituted the visual language of her brand identity, were coordinated with her packaging for every other product in the Arden range, so that a woman who equipped herself from the Arden counter presented a unified visual identity across every product that appeared on her dressing table. Brand coordination, now a standard feature of luxury cosmetics marketing, was in the 1950s still a relatively novel concept in the mass consumer market. The Arden approach was sophisticated enough to be genuinely distinctive. The drugstore alternative to the Stratton and the Rubinstein was not, in the mid-century market, a crude or embarrassing option. Coty, whose air-spun powder was arguably the most widely used face powder in America during the entire decade, produced compact cases in a range of materials and finishes that represented genuine craft production at accessible price points. The Coty Vanity case, a rectangular compact in a faux tortoiseshell celluloid case with a brass frame, retailed for approximately $1.50 and provided a mirror and a powder puff of identical functional quality to the Stratton at approximately a third of the price. Women who could not afford the Stratton and who were sufficiently honest with themselves about this limitation used the Coty without apparent embarrassment, because the compact in daily domestic use was primarily functional, and its social display function was secondary to the practical question of whether it held powder and had a decent mirror. The same woman might accept the Stratton as a gift and use it for evenings and significant occasions, while reserving the Coty for the handbag she carried to work. The collection of compacts was itself a social practice in this period. Women accumulated them through gifts, through travel, through the purchase of discontinued lines at department store sales, and the variety in the collection reflected the variety in the occasions of a woman's life, each compact calibrated, more or less consciously, to the context in which it would appear. The mirror inside the compact was the social version of the dressing table mirror, smaller, more limited in what it could show, but more useful in many ways precisely because of its limitations. A compact mirror of the standard dimension, approximately 2 inches in diameter, could show the nose and one cheek, or both cheekbones, or the entire lip area, in a single frame. It could not show the entire face. What this meant, practically, was that compact mirror use demanded that a woman already know what her face looked like, that she had the complete mental image established from her morning preparation, and was consulting the compact mirror not to construct a complete picture from scratch, but to check a specific detail against an existing template. The woman who knew her face well, who had applied and removed it, studied and adjusted it hundreds or thousands of times, could use the compact mirror to excellent effect, because she already had the context in which the detail she was checking lived. The woman who was not certain what her face looked like, in the sense of not having the comprehensive mental map, would find the compact mirror frustrating and insufficient. The compact mirror in this sense rewarded expertise. It was a tool for people who already knew what they were doing. The compact collecting culture of the 21st century, which has produced significant auction markets, dedicated collector societies, and a literature of provenance research that rivals the documentation of Victorian jewellery, preserves the objects but sometimes loses the practice. The compacts on display in glass cases at antique shows are beautiful objects. They are also, in the fullest sense, tools whose use implied a specific relationship between a woman and her own face, a specific theory of self-presentation, and a specific social choreography that is as much a part of their history as the enamel work or the hinge mechanism. The Stratton compact that sold for $4.75 in a department store in 1951 was purchased to be used, and used in public, and used well, and the woman who used it well was, in the relevant sense, a craftsperson. Her craft was the management of her own appearance, and the compact was one of her instruments. The collecting dimension of compact culture in the 1950s was already present in embryonic form, even as the objects being collected were still in active production and daily use. The connection between a decorative object's beauty and its potential future value, a connection that the antiques trade had established, and that the post-war economic expansion had made newly relevant to a middle class with disposable income and the consumer confidence to spend it on non-essential objects, was beginning to register in the way that women related to their most beautiful compacts. A Stratton enamel compact purchased as a gift was not always immediately pressed into daily handbag service. Some were placed in a drawer or a velvet-lined jewellery box, consulted occasionally for the pleasure of handling rather than for their cosmetic function. This practice, the hoarding of the beautiful object against use, the maintenance of its mint condition as a form of appreciation, is the first stage of collecting, and its presence in the domestic culture of the 1950s suggests that the compact's eventual career as a collectible was not a development imposed from outside its original context, but one that emerged naturally from within it. The specific vocabulary of compact collecting, the distinction between museum quality and user quality pieces, the premium placed on complete sets with original puff and box, the particular desirability of dead stock compacts found in old pharmacy or department store inventory and never circulated, had not yet codified in the 1950s. But the underlying values it expressed were already visible in the domestic practices of the period. A woman who kept her most beautiful compact separate from her everyday use was already making a judgment about the relationship between beauty, utility, and time. She was suggesting, implicitly, that beauty sufficient to justify preservation, rather than mere use, was beauty of a different order, beauty that belonged to a category beyond the instrumental. The social geography of the powder room, the room specifically designated for feminine appearance maintenance in the domestic spaces of the 1950s, a designation so thoroughly naturalized that the architectural distinction between the powder room and the bathroom required no explanation to any woman of the period, provided a social context for compact use that the handbag and the kitchen mirror could not replicate. The powder room was the one room in the house that functioned as genuinely female social space. Men did not enter it. Children were redirected from it during adult gatherings, and its use during a dinner party constituted a brief, legitimate withdrawal from the social performance of the evening into a space where the performance could be checked, refreshed, and recommitted to without the interruption being legible from outside. What happened in the powder room, the shared mirror, the comparative lipstick, the brief frank exchange of assessment between women who'd been performing all evening, was a form of female solidarity so embedded in the social architecture of the period that it required no articulation. You went to the powder room, you returned. The performance continued. The compact's design in this context was specifically calibrated to the powder room's compressed time budget and social dynamics. The best Stratton mechanism opened in a single smooth motion, no hesitation, no fumbling with a catch. The mirror was positioned to show the face at the angle that the powder room mirror above the sink would confirm in half a second. The puff was substantial enough to press and reset in one motion. The powder itself was formulated to set without visible build-up, so that repeated applications through the course of an evening did not produce the cakey accumulation that cheaper powders could deposit over a layer of foundation by the end of a long social occasion. The cocktail hour provided the most demanding venue for this craft, because in the cocktail hour, every instrument was simultaneously on display. There is a detail in the 1954 edition of Amy Vanderbilt's Complete Book of Etiquette that tends to stop modern readers mid-page. The hostess, Vanderbilt writes, should ideally prepare her appearance and her cocktail arrangement simultaneously, so that she's fully composed, meaning fully dressed, fully coiffed, and fully made, no later than 45 minutes before the first guest's expected arrival. Not 15 minutes, not 5, 45. Because the final 45 minutes before a dinner party were, in Vanderbilt's model of domestic performance, not for the hostess's personal preparation, but for the kitchen's final preparation, for the monitoring of temperature and timing, for the arrangement of the bar cart and the placement of the cocktail napkins, tasks that required her full, undistracted attention and that she could not perform adequately while also managing the logistics of her own face. The face had to be finished before the food entered its critical phase, and that requirement, the sequencing imperative, tells you nearly everything about what the cocktail hour meant in 1954. The suburban dinner party of the post-war American decade was not a casual social gathering, it was an exhibition. The hostess was simultaneously the curator, the exhibition space, and the primary exhibit, a set of roles that no amount of domestic comfort or interpersonal warmth could meaningfully disguise, because the scrutiny was real, constant, and socially consequential. The quality of the deviled eggs mattered, the arrangement of the crystal mattered, the temperature of the cocktails mattered, and the appearance of the hostess herself, her composure, her grooming, her apparent ease in circumstances that were, in fact, elaborately manufactured, mattered most of all because it was the frame within which every other element of the evening was perceived. A beautifully arranged table in a room where the hostess appeared harried or incompletely put together read as a failed performance. A less elaborate table in a room where the hostess appeared serene and competent read as a successful one. This was not an arbitrary aesthetic preference. It reflected a genuine social logic. The hostess was the guarantee. Her apparent command of the situation told guests that the situation was in command. The bar cart was the architectural centerpiece of the 1950s suburban living room, in a way that neither the television set nor the bookcase quite managed to be, and its arrangement was governed by protocols so specific that they constituted a minor culinary science. The bottles were arranged by height, tallest at the back, shortest at the front, and by type, with spirits on one side and mixers on the other. Glasses were aligned on the lower shelf, crystal if the occasion was formal, glass if it was a casual cocktail party, never mismatched regardless of circumstance. Ice was served in a bucket with tongs, never with a spoon, and absolutely never with the hands, a prohibition that Amy Vanderbilt addressed in at least 3 separate passages across her various books, as though she suspected that significant numbers of her readers were going home and using their hands, and she needed to keep saying it. The cocktail napkins were paper for casual occasions and linen for formal ones, and the linen required ironing, not pressing, ironing, which was a task that the afternoon before the party tended to absorb in the same way that all the other preparation tasks absorbed afternoon time, completely. The deviled egg warrants its own small treatise, because it occupied a position in the 1950s cocktail party spread that has no precise contemporary equivalent. It was simultaneously the most egalitarian and the most technically demanding of the standard first-course offerings. Egalitarian, because eggs were cheap and universally available even in the early post-war years when some food categories were still experiencing supply disruptions. Technically demanding, because the quality of a deviled egg is entirely determined by the precision of the cook. Overcooked egg whites are rubbery. Undercooked yolk filling does not set properly in the egg cavity and collapses when lifted. The piping of the yolk mixture for the properly produced deviled egg was piped, using a pastry bag with a star tip, in a specific motion that deposited the filling in a ridged oval that caught the light on each ridge, required steady hands and adequate practice. The paprika dusted on top was applied with a specific gesture, a light tapping of the fingers against a cupped palm held above the egg, distributing the spice in a fine, even cloud rather than applying it in distinct clumps. This was a technique. It had to be learned. The geometry of the room's conversational arrangement was as deliberate as the bar cart's physical organization, the standard suburban living room of the period, particularly in the ranch-style houses that constituted the dominant housing type of the post-war expansion, was long and relatively narrow, with a picture window at one end and the kitchen connection at the other. The seating arrangement for a cocktail party of 8 to 12 guests was designed to create 2 or 3 conversational clusters that remained distinct but visible to each other, close enough that guests could call across from one group to another, far enough apart that 2 simultaneous conversations could proceed without interference. Chairs were arranged at angles rather than parallel to the walls, which avoided the formal severity of a conference room layout, while still providing adequate seating for a group that would be standing and moving for the first 30 minutes of the evening before settling into the conversational groupings that the chair arrangement had pre-positioned. The hostess's movement through this environment was its own choreography. She circulated from the bar cart to the kitchen door, from the kitchen door to the seating area, from the seating area back to the bar cart, in a pattern that Amy Vanderbilt described as purposeful but unhurried, which is a description that manages to be simultaneously precise and practically useless, since the state of being unhurried while managing a kitchen, a bar, and a room full of guests is not a temperamental quality, but a technical achievement produced by sufficient preparation. The hostess, who appeared unhurried, had prepared so thoroughly that the evening's logistics had been reduced to execution of a pre-established plan. The deviled eggs already plated, the ice already cut, the bar cart already stocked, the kitchen timer already set, so that her movement through the room during the party itself was genuine circulation rather than crisis management disguised as circulation. Her own appearance during this circulation was the final element of the evening's production design, and it presented specific technical challenges that the beauty columns of the women's magazines addressed in dedicated party preparation issues published each October and November ahead of the holiday entertaining season. Foundation applied in the afternoon would, by 7 o'clock, have migrated into expression lines and settled slightly unevenly across the cheeks, requiring refreshment. Lipstick, subject to the particular attrition of cocktail hour, drinks, conversation, the absent-minded habit of pressing the lips together, had to be reapplied at least once during the pre-dinner interval. Hair, if it had been set the previous evening and preserved through the day's preparation, with careful avoidance of steam and direct humidity, would be intact, but would benefit from a final press at the crown, where the weight of the day's work tended to compress any volume that had been built into the set. The kitchen was where this maintenance occurred, and it occurred between tasks, in the 30-second interval while a sauce was reducing, in the 2 minutes while a timer counted down, in the brief passage between the stove and the refrigerator during which no hands were occupied, and the small mirror propped above the kitchen windowsill could be consulted. This mirror, smaller than the vanity mirror, often the compact mirror placed against a kitchen canister, was the working woman's tool, not the ceremonial instrument of the dressing table. It showed what it needed to show, whether the lipstick required correction, whether the under eye needed a dab of powder, whether the hair at the temple had escaped its setting. It was not consulted for comprehensive review, it was consulted for rapid verification of specific details. The woman at the kitchen windowsill mirror in the 15 minutes before her guests arrived was not examining her face, she was confirming it. The performance of effortlessness, the central, exhausting, brilliant theatrical achievement of the 1950s dinner party hostess, required that by the time the doorbell rang, every trace of the day's preparation had been erased from her person. The flour, if there had been flour, was gone. The kitchen steam that had threatened the hair was countered. The lipstick was fresh. She opened the door looking as though the party had always been happening, and she had simply been waiting for this particular moment to begin. The financial architecture of the 1950s dinner party has been almost entirely overlooked by historians of domestic culture, who tend to focus on the social and aesthetic dimensions of the ritual rather than its economic underpinning. A dinner party for 8 in a suburban household in 1954 represented a significant discretionary expenditure. The fresh flowers alone, a standard centerpiece arrangement in a vase rented or owned, typically featuring gladioli or carnations in the season's fashionable colors, might cost as much as $2 at a suburban florist, approximately the equivalent of a skilled worker's hourly wage in the period. The crystal cocktail glasses that Vanderbilt's etiquette manuals treated as self-evident requirements of the properly appointed bar cart were capital investments, purchased a few pieces at a time over years, stored carefully to prevent chipping, and insured against breakage in the same domestic budget category as silverware and china. The bar cart itself, the wheeled chromium or wrought iron trolley that appeared in virtually every aspirational decorating magazine photograph of the period, was a piece of furniture representing between $20 and $60 in retail price, a range that in 1954 spanned the gap between a modest household luxury and a significant household acquisition. The grocery expenditure for a proper dinner party of the period is equally illuminating. The standard mid-decade dinner party menu, deviled eggs and canapes for cocktails, followed by a roast with 2 vegetables, a salad course and a dessert, required fresh ingredients that were, by modern standards, relatively expensive relative to household income, but that the social obligation of the dinner party made essentially mandatory. The deviled egg, requiring 18 eggs for a party of 8, plus the hostess. The standard calculation was slightly more than 2 per person, plus the prepared mustard, the mayonnaise, the paprika, and the parsley garnish, cost approximately 30 cents in raw materials. The roast, invariably beef in this period, when American beef consumption was at its highest per capita level in the century, might represent 15% of the week's grocery budget in a household at the median income level. The hosting of dinner parties was, in this period, a form of economic performance as much as a social one. To host properly was to demonstrate not just taste and skill, but financial adequacy, the ability to provision abundance for others as evidence of stability. The hostess who managed this expenditure, executed this menu, maintained this presentation, and appeared throughout the evening composed and unflustered, was performing a form of domestic labour whose complexity and skill content was almost never acknowledged by the social context in which it was embedded, because the acknowledgement of effort would have undermined the very performance it was supporting. The dinner party was most successful when it appeared to have produced itself, when the deviled eggs appeared on their platter without evidence of the 40 minutes required to prepare them, when the roast arrived at table at exactly the right temperature without any visible reference to the kitchen thermometer that had been consulted 7 times in the preceding hour. The woman who achieved this had not merely cooked and arranged and decorated, she had engineered an illusion, and she had maintained that illusion from the moment the first guest arrived until the moment the last guest left, at which point she was free, at last, to let the illusion drop. The costume she opened it in was subject to regulations as specific as any professional uniform. And understanding those regulations requires understanding the structural architecture they were designed to contain. The Warner Brothers Corset Company published a measurement guide in 1953 that listed, without apology or apparent awareness that any explanation might be required, the ideal measurements for an American woman's figure: 36-inch bust, 24-inch waist, 36-inch hip. This was not a descriptive document. It was a prescriptive one. The measurements it listed were not the measurements of a statistical average. The average waist measurement of an American woman in 1953 was 27.5 inches, according to census data. But the measurements of an ideal that the corsetry industry had constructed, and now proposed to sell back to women as an achievable goal, with their products as the mechanism of achievement: the girdle, the foundation garment, the corselet, the waspy, the merry widow. These were the engineering solutions to the gap between the body that existed and the body that the Warner Brothers Corset Company believed it should be. By 1950, an estimated 90% of American women who were not elderly wore some form of foundation garment on a daily basis. The garment industry built its entire silhouette on the assumption of this understructure, and the women who wore the garments understood, with varying degrees of explicit articulation, that what they were managing was not merely their figures, but the specific cultural contract that the decade had constructed between female embodiment and social acceptability. The girdle of the early 1950s was a substantial piece of engineering. The materials available to foundation garment manufacturers in this period included rubber, rayon, nylon, and the newly introduced elastic knit fabrics that Lastex had developed from a rubber core yarn in the 1930s, and that permitted a degree of stretch and recovery previously unachievable in woven garments. The typical girdle of the period extended from the natural waist to the upper thigh, with a panel construction that provided maximum compression at the abdomen and graduated release toward the hip. Stays, originally made of whalebone, increasingly of flat steel or nylon spiral in this period, were inserted at the sides and sometimes the back to prevent the garment from rolling down during movement. Garters, attached to the lower edge of the girdle at 4 to 6 points around the circumference, held the stockings in place with a snapping metal clasp that required, in the morning sequence of dressing, approximately 12 individual fastening operations per pair of stockings, a task that most women performed so automatically that they could do it while simultaneously brushing their teeth or reviewing a list. The specific physics of dressing in the full foundation sequence of the decade, girdle, stockings, brassiere, slip, dress, and depending on the occasion, petticoats, required approximately 15 to 25 minutes from beginning to complete, and the sequence had an established order that could not be meaningfully rearranged. Girdle first, over the hips, smoothed from the waist down, the garter tabs arranged at equidistant points around the thigh. Stockings, second, rolled from the toe, worked over the foot and up the leg in a single smooth movement to prevent laddering, attached to the garters with the stocking seam running in a straight vertical line from heel to upper thigh. The straight seam was not optional. In 1953, a woman with a crooked stocking seam was communicating either carelessness or technical incompetence, neither of which was what she wished to communicate. Brassiere third, positioned and adjusted before the slip went over it, because the slip fabric, once in place, made brassiere adjustment significantly more difficult. Slip fourth, the undersurface over which the dress would move throughout the day, preventing the dress fabric from clinging to the stockings or to the girdle's latex surface. Then the dress of the mid-decade silhouette, the new look profile that Christian Dior had introduced in 1947 and that had permeated the American market at every price point from Balenciaga to Sears by the early 50s, presented specific structural requirements that the undergarments were designed to satisfy. The defined waist of the new look demanded compression. The full skirt, whether achieved with layers of net petticoat or a structured horsehair crinoline, demanded a hip smooth enough that the skirt could fall and swing freely without catching on a visible edge or crease. The pointed brassiere silhouette, which the women's fashion magazines had established as definitionally correct for the decade and which required a specific construction, the bullet or torpedo cup, produced by circular stitching on a flat fabric rather than the modern practice of cutting three-dimensional cups from foam, created a chest profile that was designed to be visible through the fitted bodice of the day's dress as a deliberate statement of correct underpinning. The dress was evidence of the undergarments. The undergarments were evidence of a set of values. The values were legible in the silhouette. The petticoat, specifically the multi-layer net or crinoline petticoat that produced the bouffant skirt silhouette associated with the late 1950s, was a garment of genuine structural complexity, washing poorly, storing awkwardly, and contributing to the specific domestic challenge of the decade's laundry. Net petticoats could not be machine washed without tangling irreparably. They required hand washing in a mild soap solution, then hanging to air dry in a shape maintained by the petticoat's own structure, then potentially restarching with a diluted starch solution applied by spray or dip to restore the stiffness that washing removed. The maintenance burden of the decade's wardrobe is a dimension of women's history that tends to be overlooked in accounts focused on the aesthetic results, but it was substantial, and it was real, and it was borne almost exclusively by women themselves, either personally or through the labour of domestic employees in households that could afford them. Gloves were the most socially codified element of the complete daytime outfit, and the specific rules governing them reveal the precise calibration of formality that the decade maintained across different times of day and different social contexts. White cotton gloves were worn for church, for formal afternoon calls, for weddings, and for any occasion at which the handshake with a social superior was expected. Short gloves, wrist length, were the standard for everyday shopping and business errands. Long gloves, elbow length or above, were for evening occasions exclusively, and their removal sequence at the dinner table was itself a prescribed ritual. Peel from the elbow down to the wrist, fold the fingers back and tuck the entire glove inside the palm. Never place the glove on the table or the dinner plate, and store it in the lap or the evening bag. The rules for gloves at cocktail parties were different from the rules for gloves at teas, which were different from the rules for gloves at formal dances. The system was internally coherent and socially enforced, which meant that deviations were both noticed and interpreted as evidence of either unfamiliarity with the code or deliberate rejection of it, either of which communicated information about the wearer that she may or may not have intended to convey. The daylight versus evening distinction in the wardrobe was not merely a matter of formality level, but of fabric, colour, and accessory type. Daytime fabrics in this period were cotton, wool, and the synthetic blends that the post-war petrochemical industry was introducing at an accelerating pace. Nylon, dacron, orlon, each with its own specific care requirements and its own specific social valence. Silk and satin were evening materials. Sequins, beading, and metallic thread were evening materials. Black was technically acceptable for daytime in this period, though many etiquette authorities of the early decade still categorized it as primarily a formal and evening color, a position that was eroding in practice faster than it was eroding in print, as women who appreciated the slimming and simplifying function of black in a wardrobe built around mix and match principles adopted it regardless of official guidance. The position of the hemline vis-à-vis the knee, which in this period was below the knee for daytime, approaching the knee for cocktail, at or slightly below the mid-calf for formal evening, was the single most legible indicator of a garment's intended occasion, more reliable than colour or fabric, because hemlines were precisely standardized, and the violations of that standardization were immediately visible to any trained observer. What is most striking about the complete wardrobe architecture of the 1950s, viewed at this distance, is not its restrictiveness, which is real, but its comprehensiveness. The system provided an answer to every dressing question that could arise in the course of an adult woman's social and professional life. There was no ambiguity about what to wear to a formal evening dinner, a weekday lunch with a friend, a church service, a cocktail party, or a children's birthday party at which the other mothers would be watching. The rules, once learned, eliminated the cognitive load of clothing selection by reducing it to a set of contextual inputs with prescribed outputs. A woman who had internalized the wardrobe rules of the decade did not agonize over what to wear. She knew what to wear, and knowing, in the context of an era that demanded so much simultaneous performance, was its own form of freedom, the freedom of the expert, which is always slightly different from the freedom of the improviser. The specific economic history of the foundation garment in the 1950s reveals a consumer market that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more coercive than either its defenders or its critics have typically acknowledged. The top tier of the foundation garment market, brands including Warner's, Maidenform, Playtex, and the imported French makes available at high-end department store corsetry departments, was engaged in genuine technical innovation throughout the decade, producing garments that addressed the biomechanical challenges of compression with increasing sophistication. The Playtex living girdle, introduced in 1947 and refined through the early 50s, used a natural latex rubber construction that could be put on and taken off without the complex system of hooks and eyes and stays that earlier girdle construction had required, making the daily donning sequence significantly faster and less demanding of physical dexterity The maiden form I Dreamed I advertising campaign, which ran from 1949 through the 60s and featured women photographed in public settings, wearing only their maiden form bra above the waist, was both a marketing triumph and, in retrospect, a fascinating artifact of the specific cultural moment in which a woman's undergarments were understood as the technical foundation of her public presentation, rather than as her private domain. The girdle's position in the 1950s social economy was not merely functional, but symbolic in a way that is difficult to communicate to contemporary readers without seeming to overstate it. In a decade when the visible management of the female body was understood as evidence of character rather than as the product of cultural pressure, when a woman who wore no foundation garment might be described, in the etiquette literature of the period, as letting herself go, a phrase of enormous moral weight in its context. The decision to wear or not wear the garment was not simply a matter of personal comfort. It was a public statement, legible to other women, with a precision that men were generally not equipped to read, about the wearer's relationship to the standards of her community. A woman without her girdle was a woman who had decided implicitly that the standards did not apply to her, a decision that could be understood as bohemian, as eccentric, as defiant, or simply as negligent, depending entirely on the context and the observer. The question of what happened to the foundation garment at the end of the day, the physical relief of its removal, the private renegotiation of the body's own shape unmediated by compression, is a dimension of the 1950s domestic experience that women's accounts of the period describe with a vividness and emotional specificity that suggests it was anything but trivial. The evening removal of the girdle appears in diaries, letters, and oral history interviews as a genuinely pleasurable ritual, a daily restoration of bodily autonomy that preceded even the removal of shoes or the unpinning of hair. The body, returned to itself after hours of architectural management, felt the same way, these accounts suggest, that the face felt after the cold cream had done its work and the tissues had been disposed of, lighter, released, and constituted again from the inside rather than the outside. The daily dialectic between the managed self and the natural one, the corseted body and the uncorseted body, the painted face and the cleansed one, was not a simple narrative of oppression and liberation. It was a negotiation between two versions of the self, each with its own legitimate claims, conducted in private every day, by women who had developed enough relationship with both versions to navigate between them with something approaching ease. The garment, properly arranged over the properly maintained foundation, presented the body in the silhouette that the decade required. The face, properly composed, framed that silhouette from above. And at the absolute centre of that composition, in the mid-century woman's aesthetic arsenal, the thing she reached for in the morning before almost anything else, the thing she touched up in the kitchen, in the car, in the 30-second interval between one obligation and the next, was a cylinder of pigmented wax that had spent the previous decade becoming something far more significant than a cosmetic. It had become a symbol. And the story of that symbol is the story of the entire era, compressed into a single brilliant, defiant shade of red. In October of 1952, Charles Revson ran a full-page advertisement in Vogue magazine for a coordinated lipstick and nail enamel set called Fire and Ice. The advertisement, conceived by Doris Fleischmann and designed with a photograph by Richard Avedon that showed model Dorian Lee in a silver sequined gown and a scarlet hooded cape. Her eyes direct, her mouth painted an almost violent shade of red, was accompanied by a quiz. 23 questions, beginning with, "Have you ever danced with your shoes off?" and proceeding through increasingly pointed inquiries about a woman's relationship with personal desire, risk, and self-presentation. Do you close your eyes when you're kissed? Have you ever wanted to wear an ankle bracelet? Have you ever painted a room, or your car, or a fence? The woman who answered yes to at least 8 of these questions was, Revson's copy declared, made for fire and ice, which was to say, made for a shade of red lipstick so specifically calibrated in its balance of blue and orange undertones that it would read as simultaneously warm and cool, aggressive and feminine, modern and timeless. The quiz ran in 12 women's magazines that month. Revlon's sales increased by 40% in the fourth quarter of 1952, and the red lipstick, which had spent 2 decades transitioning from theatrical staple to wartime symbol, completed its journey into something that no cosmetics executive had quite anticipated: a statement of character, a declaration of self. The history of red pigment on the human mouth is long enough to make the 1950s chapter look very recent indeed. Red ochre cosmetics recovered from archaeological sites in Morocco have been dated to approximately 100,000 years before the current era, which means that the impulse to colour the lip preceded by an enormous margin of time the development of agricultural civilization, writing, the wheel, or any of the other technological achievements that historians typically use to define the beginning of human cultural complexity. The specific cultural meanings assigned to the red mouth have varied so comprehensively across time and geography that any attempt to construct a universal theory founders immediately on the diversity of the evidence. In some cultures and periods, red lip colour indicated availability, in others, status, in others, ritual consecration, in others still, professional identity of a kind that we might today describe as occupational. What is consistent across this enormous range of cultural contexts is that the red mouth is never simply decorative. It is always also a sign. It is always communicating something, even in contexts where the communication has become so thoroughly naturalized that it no longer requires conscious interpretation. The particular history that flows most directly into the 1950s is the history of theatrical makeup, which had standardized red lip color as a professional necessity by the early decades of the 20th century. Stage lighting of the period, first gas and then early incandescent systems, washed the face of a performer at distance into a pallid, feature-erasing blank, unless the face had been painted to compensate for the light's effect. The lips, being soft tissue with relatively low reflectivity, disappeared entirely under most early theatrical lighting unless they were painted to a high colour intensity. Max Factor, who arrived in the United States from Poland in 1904 carrying a bag of theatrical makeup supplies that he had been producing for the Imperial Russian Opera, understood theatrical requirements with a precision that his American competitors lacked, and his early Los Angeles studio served the booming film industry that had located itself in Southern California largely because of the quality of the natural light available for silent film exterior photography. By the 1920s, Factor had codified a range of lip colors calibrated to the specific demands of black and white film stock, tungsten lighting, and the new Technicolor process that made color films commercially viable. His color harmony system, which matched lip, eyeshadow, and face powder tones to each other and to the individual's complexion type, was the first systematic application of color theory to mass-market cosmetic product development, and it determined the product range that reached women through drugstores and department stores for the next 3 decades. The wartime chapter of the red lipstick story is the one most frequently cited, and for good reason. It represents the moment when a decorative product was consciously conscripted into ideological service in a way that permanently altered its cultural meaning. When the United States War Department conducted research in 1942 on the morale of women working in defense industry plants, the findings included the unexpected conclusion that access to cosmetics, specifically lipstick, appeared to correlate with worker productivity and morale in a statistically significant way. The analysis of this finding was, by our standards, naive. The assumption that lipstick improved morale because it made women feel attractive reflected a reductive understanding of what lipstick was doing. What lipstick was actually doing, in the context of a woman working a 12-hour shift on a factory floor in 1942, was providing continuity, a physical connection to a peacetime identity, and a set of feminine practices that the wartime emergency had otherwise comprehensively disrupted. The red lip on the factory floor was not vanity, it was refusal. It was the insistence that the woman behind the war effort was still the woman she'd been before it, and would be the woman she intended to be after it. Elizabeth Arden was among the first to understand and articulate this interpretation explicitly. Her Montezuma red lipstick, released in coordination with the debut of the United States Marine Corps Women's Reserve's red lipstick regulation in 1943, was sold with copy that described the red lip explicitly as an emblem of patriotic femininity rather than personal vanity. The government agreed. Lipstick was exempted from wartime rationing restrictions. The signal could not have been clearer. Tangi, the brand that had dominated the lipstick market since its introduction in 1923 as a colour change product that shifted from an orange tone in the tube to a pink tone on the lip, adjusted its product line during the war years to include deeper, redder shades that the wartime aesthetic demanded, and ran advertising that positioned these shades in explicitly patriotic terms. A woman who makes a victory garden makes a better-looking lipstick than one who doesn't. This was, not to put too fine a point on it, an extraordinary piece of copy, but it captured accurately the rhetorical move that the wartime cosmetics industry made wholesale. Domestically feminine and nationally productive were not merely compatible but identical. The woman who maintained her appearance was the woman who maintained morale. The woman who wore red lipstick was the woman who had not surrendered anything, not personally and not nationally. Red was resistance. It was just also, in the same gesture, a best-selling product. By the early 1950s, the red lipstick had arrived at its post-war apotheosis with a degree of cultural sophistication that neither the wartime patriotism narrative nor the simple glamour story quite captures. Revlon's shade range in the early decade included names: Cherries in the Snow, Fire and Ice, Bachelor's Carnation, Raven Red, that were themselves miniature poems, each one proposing not just a colour but a relationship to experience, a persona, an emotional register. Cherries in the Snow suggested a specific combination of warmth and coldness, accessibility and distance, exactly the tonal balance that the decade's feminine ideal required. Fire and Ice was its more aggressive companion, the shade for a woman who had decided to stop performing accessibility and start performing power. The Revlon marketing apparatus, operating through advertising, through editorial placements in women's magazines, through department store demonstrators who applied samples directly to customers' lips, built around each shade a complete cultural context that women could inhabit rather than simply purchase. You did not buy a lipstick. You adopted a position. The application of red lipstick without a mirror, which is the specific technical achievement that the title of this compilation has been circling all along, is the final chapter in the story of the red lip as armour, because it represents the completeness of the internalization. A woman who required a mirror to apply her red lipstick was still in an early stage of her relationship with the product. She was still watching herself do it. A woman who did not require the mirror had moved past watching into knowing. She had applied the shade enough times, in enough contexts, with enough variation, that the movement of the brush or the tube was as reliable as handwriting. The lower lip first, following the natural curve from corner to centre, with the product applied in a single firm stroke. Then the upper lip, the more technically demanding surface, with its central peak requiring a slight upward inflection of the wrist at the cupid's bow that was essentially impossible to execute correctly if you were thinking about it, and essentially automatic if you were not. Then the press, lips together, briefly, to transfer the colour from the initial application surface to the contact surface between the lips, distributing the pigment across the full mouth in the way that a single pass application could not achieve. Then the blot, a single press against a tissue that removed the excess product and left the colour bonded to the lip surface rather than sitting on top of it, which was the difference between a lip colour that lasted 4 hours and one that lasted 2. The specific chemistry of red lipstick in the 1950s was more technically complex than the finished product's apparent simplicity suggested. The formulation of a lipstick involves the creation of a stable emulsion of waxes, oils, and pigments that must simultaneously adhere to a soft, moving tissue surface, resist the moisture and acidity of the oral environment, maintain its color stability under ultraviolet light and temperature variation, and transfer cleanly and completely enough to deposit color without smearing outside the lip line. The pigments available for red lipstick in the early decades of the 20th century were severely limited by the regulatory environment. Aniline dyes, widely used in the Victorian and Edwardian eras for their intensity, were found to be carcinogenic and were progressively banned by the Food and Drug Administration through the 1930s and 40s. Synthetic coal tar dyes, which provided the intensely saturated blues and reds that wartime lipstick required, were permitted in some formulations but required ongoing regulatory scrutiny. The development of the specific reds available in Revlon's 1950s range, the precise blue red of Fire and Ice, the more orange-inflected warmth of Bachelor's Carnation, represented years of pigment chemistry work conducted by research laboratories that had to balance color intensity against skin safety against formula stability in a way that no advertising copy could adequately convey. The role of the beauty editor in translating this technical landscape into intelligible guidance for the general reader is one of the underappreciated professional histories of the 20th century. Women like Diana Vreeland at Harper's Bazaar and Jessica Daves at Vogue brought to their editorial roles not merely taste and authority, but a genuine working knowledge of the cosmetic chemistry and manufacturing processes behind the products they covered, knowledge acquired through years of cultivated relationships with the chemists and product developers at the major cosmetics houses, who understood that a favorable editorial mention was worth considerably more than any comparable advertising expenditure. The beauty editor's recommendation was trusted in a way that the advertising page was not, because readers understood correctly that editorial content reflected genuine expertise rather than paid endorsement. The system was not without its conflicts of interest. The relationship between editorial and advertising departments in women's magazines was complex and not always at arm's length, but it produced at its best genuinely useful technical guidance filtered through the sensibility of an expert who had actually applied, tested, and evaluated the products she described. The mid-century red lipstick's persistence into the present day as both a product category and a cultural symbol reflects something genuinely resistant about the object itself, resistant to fashion, to generational revision, to the many times that trend forecasters have announced its retirement. The red lip has been declared dead approximately every decade since the 1960s, and has returned in each subsequent decade with a specificity of cultural meaning that adapts to its moment, while maintaining the core assertion, this woman has made a decision about how she will appear in the world, and she made it deliberately, and she's comfortable with the visibility it produces. The woman in 1953 who reached for her Revlon Fire and Ice before walking out the door was making the same fundamental gesture as the woman in the 21st century who does the same. The gesture of the armor, assumed voluntarily, and worn as a form of self-declaration rather than concealment. The mirror was optional. The gesture was not. The women who had done this every day for 15 years could do it in moving vehicles, in dim light, in the 30 seconds between one task and the next without stopping, without checking, without the performance of effort that a more self-conscious relationship with the action would have required. They did not apply their red lipstick. They deployed it, the way a skilled craftsperson deploys a tool, with the economy of motion that only practice provides, with the confidence of a person who no longer needs to watch herself to know that what she is doing is right. The mirror had been made optional. The armor had been made automatic. And the woman who walked out of her door in the morning, red-lipped and composed, in her crinolines and her foundation garment and her precisely set hair and her carefully managed eye, was not the woman that a century of beauty advertising had tried to construct from the outside in. She was the woman who had decided from the inside out exactly who she was going to be, and had acquired, through years of daily practice in the ritual of her own preparation, the technical fluency to produce that person on demand without a mirror, without time, and without apparent effort. Which was, in the 1950s, the most radical thing she could possibly have done, and also, in its way, the most beautiful.